lot of times when I talk about the missing 411 phenomenon, people just tell me, Aidan, they probably just fell into a cave. Well, I'd like to know how that happened to an entire colony of people back in the 1500s. I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Before we get started today, I'm going to ask you to smash that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, do all of those little things. And if you want to support us, you can head over to patreon.com/thelorelodge and subscribe to any one of our numerous tiers that have very fun names like Trainee and Park Ranger and stuff like that. And you get perks and benefits. It's nice, it's fun. But anyway, into the story. In 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh was granted a charter to settle a colony somewhere on the east coast of the United States in what is now the Outer Banks region up through the Chesapeake. He basically had any of this territory that he could settle, and what he did was choose a rather non-resource filled island off the coast of North Carolina. Now, the stipulation for this charter that he was granted by Queen Elizabeth I was that the colony must be established by 1591, and if it wasn't, then he lost his rights to settle the land. This was a bit of a problem for Sir Walter Raleigh because at the time, the British were involved in the Anglo-Spanish War, where they were fighting with, as you can imagine, the Spanish. Now, this war with Spain did have its bearing on this event as a whole, because at the end of the day, Spain was colonizing the New World, and England didn't really have a colony in continental North America yet. So this was going to serve both as an economic boon, as well as a good military base where they could stage attacks or defense maneuvers against Spanish fleets operating in the area. Originally, the expedition planned for 690 colonists to disembark on Roanoke Island and set up their new settlement there. But there was a bit of a problem, and that was that A, nowhere near that many people signed up. They were short by almost 100 people. And also, they did not have the supplies for that. Now, the reason they didn't have the supplies for that is not the fault of the planners, but rather the fact that the planners didn't plan for the unplanned. And what I mean by that is that they sent 7 ships. One of these, the flagship, the Tiger, was carrying most of the colony's supplies. It was a galleass, it was a large, large ship, basically meant to transport the majority of the supplies, the necessary equipment, and some of the people, whereas a large number of people were also set on the other ships. And this was almost entirely military personnel. These were soldier colonists. These were not women and children. It was going to be a military fort that they were setting up. Now, when they sent these 7 ships, one of them got lost as they were rounding off Spain, because at the time, the way that you would actually go to the New World was you would sail down to Portugal and then head across the Atlantic straight over to the Caribbean, and then you would disembark there, resupply, and head back up into North America. Now, later on, that would change because it's much faster to go through the Northern Arctic, or the North Atlantic than it is to go through the middle of the Atlantic. It's much wider there. Although most people don't seem to realize exactly how far south most of North America is. Pennsylvania, for example, is actually directly across the ocean from Portugal, which is why it's so confusingly hot here. So as these ships were coming down past Portugal, the Tiger, the flagship, got itself separated from the rest of the fleet. And they had planned for this. They were like, okay, if any of the ships go missing, we're going to regroup on the southern side of Puerto Rico. And so the Tiger made it before any of the other ships, and then it was met by the Elizabeth, but the other 5 ships did not rendezvous with them in Puerto Rico. They did meet up with a few of them when they got further north into the Outer Banks, but some of them were reassigned to go other places, and most importantly, the Tiger ran ashore. It hit a shoal, and it actually destroyed most of the supplies on board. So while they were prepared initially to go in and make this settlement, they had a bit of a catastrophic disaster happen. Now, this probably could have been avoided if they had planned better regarding where they were going to establish the colony, because the Outer Banks are notoriously shallow for a wide range of how close you get to land. And these aren't, little boats. These aren't yachts. These were big sailing ships that displaced a lot of water and could sink many feet into the ocean. Now, the second this fleet actually did make it to Roanoke, they kind of screwed up. They went and met with the natives who had met English explorers before, about a year earlier, and they had had good relations. They actually were planning to set all of this up. Now, when Sir Ralph Lane, the man in charge of this expedition, the colony specifically, he was not Walter Raleigh was the one who owned the land, but Ralph Lane was the one in charge of the colony itself. So when they got there, they met with the natives, they had a nice dinner, talked everything out, made some plans. But as they were leaving, they discovered that a silver cup had gone missing and assumed that it was stolen by one of the natives. And of course, the way to get your silver cut back is to ask for it, but the natives denied that they had stolen it. So, the proportional response here was, of course, to massacre a bunch of them, which immediately kind of put things off on a bad foot with the Native American tribes, the Secatan people specifically. But they were able to recover from this, and they actually made a deal with the Secatan that they would settle at Roanoke specifically. They would be there in kind of a joint settlement with the Secatan people, who were led by a chieftain by the name of Pemisipan. It took a little bit of time to get the colony actually established. They'd left over the summer, but by September 8th, 1585, the last of the ships had left back for England, and they left behind 107 colonists. Over the winter, they attempted explorations and met with some of the other native tribes, but this uncanny phenomenon was happening. Anytime the English would enter a settlement, by the time they were leaving, people were getting sick, and they did not know why. The English didn't understand germ theory at the time, and neither did the Native Americans. What they thought was that the English were casting spells or using supernatural forces to cause them to get sick. Now, that's not entirely untrue, but it certainly wasn't purposeful by the English. They didn't know what they were doing, but that doesn't change the fact that the Native Americans did suffer from probably something like influenza or smallpox. Now, partially as a result of the English putting strain on the Secatan people for goods and resources for survival simply because they had lost most of their own, as well as this issue of sickness and just kind of the mutual distrust between the two groups, eventually hostilities did begin to emerge between Pemisipan and Ralph Lane's colony. Pemisipan, realizing that he was technologically outclassed, made a different decision than just openly fighting with the English. They ostensibly had peace deals, and they were supposed to be helping one another, but behind Lane's back, Pemisipan went to some of the other tribes on the mainland and told them that the English were planning to move inland and probably attack them. Then he went to the English and told them that if they were to go further inland, they would likely be attacked by hostile natives. Now, the English still went inland and were prepared and expected hostilities, but the problem was they were told essentially there was a planned ambush, a planned attack. So when they got there, they immediately went after the native warriors waiting for them. But the natives on the mainland weren't expecting to be attacking anybody. They were just kind of there to make sure that they greeted these people and smoothed things over. So Lane was able to actually capture the chief of one of these other tribes. So Lane and the chief of the Chowanoke, who was named Menetonen, basically came to an understanding about what had actually happened. They were like, okay, Pemisipan's the bad guy here. He's the one that we can't really trust. But they did the colonists did still need those Secatan resources and their help to survive. So they couldn't openly fight with him, but at the same time they thought it best to reorganize and found another colony somewhere further up north towards the Chesapeake, where they had been told by Menetonen's son, Skiko, that there was a passage north through the water. And they thought that this meant that they might have even found a passage to the Pacific, but no. But there was also talk of valuable metal, and they thought that could be copper, which could be useful for trade, or at the very least, they could be dealing with gold. And of course, gold is obviously what they were that was what they wanted, you know? Everybody wants some gold. However, they were not prepared to make this resettlement effort until supplies arrived, and they had been told by the ships that left in September that those supplies would arrive by Easter. So they sat back, they waited, and instead of sending everybody north, Lane led about 40 men on an expedition north into the Chesapeake to try and figure out what was going on, and figure out what was there and where a good spot to land would be. And this would have gone fine if they could have relied on resources and trade with the Native Americans of the region, which they expected they would be able to. However, Pemisipan, ever the, I don't want to use the word conniving, but ever the clever tactician that he was, actually sent word ahead that the English were hostile and that they would be attacking people. They would be, basically coming under a false pretense of peace. And so for this reason, whenever the English were spotted, the inhabitants of the villages around that area would all withdraw further into the mainland and basically take all of their food with them. So even if the English tried to loot their villages, they wouldn't be able to actually get anything of use. So after essentially spending the entire winter up here in the Chesapeake and coming back down south, they were starving, they were sick, they weren't doing very well. And they get down back to Roanoke, and Pemisipan actually thought Lane was dead and had been planning an assault on the remaining colonists to remove them for good. Now, with Lane alive and his reinforcements there, and again, you've got to remember that while the Native Americans vastly outnumbered the English, they did not outgun the English by any means, and the English had a fort. So the natives would have to attempt an assault that really was not going to go in their favor. They might be able to lay siege, but there was a chance that the English would come back with more supplies, and Lane actually informed Pemisipan that the English fleet would be arriving soon to force his hand, so that he would either have to attack or change his plans. The result was, he changed his plans. Rather than openly attacking, he instead just dropped all the pretenses of working together, and they decided they were going to withdraw. They were going to go off the island, they were going to go back to the mainland, and they weren't going to help the English anymore, which would have led to the English starving to death. One thing that was working in Lane's favor is that a hostage, the son of Menetanen, a man named Skiko, was actually very much on the side of the English despite being a hostage. Now, this could boil down to Native American tribal politics, or simply him deciding that he liked the English and wanted to better Native American society with some of the technological advancements that the English had brought with them. In any case, he actually warned Lane that there was a planned war council for June 10th, 1586. With this information, Lane was able to put together a plan to strike first to prevent his encampment from being overrun. So, on May 31st, Lane and his men slaughtered all of the Native American warriors stationed on Roanoke to prevent them from getting back to the mainland and informing Pemisipan that there was in fact an attack coming. So they killed all the warriors on Roanoke, and then the next morning, on June 1st, they went over and Lane brought 25 men, and they were going into essentially peace talks, negotiations to try and figure out something so that it didn't come to blows. But rather than actually going in and having these peace talks, what he did was get everyone into a room and then have all of his much better armed and armored men slaughter the war council. So Pemisipan actually did in fact escape and ran out into the woods, but he was shot, wounded, brought back, executed, and his head put on a pike outside of the Roanoke colony. Now, despite this tactical success, Lane still did not have the resources, first of all, to feed his own people throughout the winter, but second, to withstand the very, very, very likely Native American retribution. So they had to make a decision. They either had to try and stick with it and hope that those supplies came, which you must remember this is in the middle of the Anglo-Spanish War, so there was a chance things were going to get delayed, which when we get into part 2 of this next week, you'll understand what I mean by that. Luckily for them, around this exact time, Sir Francis Drake was sailing up from the Caribbean with his fleet, and they were able to get word to him out at sea, and he came by, did not have the supplies to keep the Roanoke colony going, but he did have space and supplies on his ships to make the voyage back to England with the remaining colonists. So that's what they did. And these colonists actually brought tobacco, corn, and potatoes to England for the first time in history. So, great success. And aside from, the tobacco and food, they also captured a Spanish galleon loaded with gold. So, at the end of the day, unsuccessful colony, but successful expedition. But the English were not to be deterred by their lack of success in establishing a successful colony this time. Instead, they would make a decision to return under the leadership of John White, an author and poet, who decided to be a governor of a colony. Qualifications? That is the famous Lost Colony of Roanoke, and we'll get into that next week in part 2 of this episode. My name's Aidan Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.